The last episode of Game of Gold has just kicked off, and already in the fourth hand we see a crazy play. Fedor lays down a mate flush on the turn in a three-way pot against two opponents and folds the best hand. Let's break down this hand starting from pre-flop. Maria opens under the gun of around 175 big blinds with king 10 off. At first glance, this might look a little bit loose, but I think in a six-handed game, this is actually very standard. Folds around to the button to Fedor, who sits there with 6-5 suited and 120 big blinds. This hand could sometimes 3-bet, but for the most part, flatting here is absolutely fine. You also prefer keeping ranges wide and playing post-flop in position against other players with great playability. Solvers usually 3-bet this hand mostly for board coverage, so you also have some lower suited connected hands in your 3-betting range when the board runs out a certain way. So flatting here absolutely fine, and it falls to Johan in the big blind, who decides to overcall ace-jack offsuit. Also extremely standard play. This hand would never squeeze here with such deep stack sizes. It just has too bad close-flop playability when you get called. You need suited hands, more connected hands that can make stronger holdings than strong top pairs for the most part to squeeze in these spots, and blockers are not as relevant yet. With stacks as deep, that is more important when you're shorter. Also, picking up the dead money in comparison to your stack and the risk you're going to take throughout the hand is just not worth the squeeze. So, very standard overcall. The flop comes king, queen, 9 flush draw. Johan decides to lead out small for a min bet, and this is extremely unconventional. I know Johan plays very exploitatively and is a super good poker player with a lot of good thought process, so he certainly has his reasons behind it, and I wondered what that could be. If you look at the big blind overcall range, he has most of the offsuit two-pair combinations here. Nobody of the other two guys has hands like queen 9 offsuit or king 9 offsuit in his range. So I think a lot of his thought process evolves around that. He has a lot of two-pair combinations nobody else has. Nobody else has jack 10 offsuit. So he has a huge amount of offsuit two pairs and straights that other players don't have. However, if he starts to lead hands as strong as those ones, his checking range becomes quite vulnerable, and he has a lot of medium strength hands like a weak king, king 5 suited, queen 8 suited, and hands like that, or even 10-9 off that really need to be protected in the checking range. And if you lead here, you're not certainly going to do your range a favor. However, we are not really going to look at a theoretical side of play today anyway, because 200 BB three-way poker is not solved too far yet to my knowledge. So let's try to take this from an exploitative point of view, just how Johan does it here. Maria's range has a lot of calls without any alternatives, huge amount of one-pair hands with added equity like a diamond, a gut shot, just a strong queen, just a strong king, a lot of calls. Fedor's range behind will reduce her raises as well, and I think her hand is a very, very straightforward call. Similarly for Fedor, his hand is also a super straightforward call. He just wants to see a turn as cheaply as possible. Two ranges having VP IP'd before him also means there's probably some resistance to raises. He also doesn't want to build a pot against bigger flush draws, so nothing really exciting here, besides Johan's lead, of course. Then on the turn, it gets really interesting. The 10 completes a flush and a straight at the same time. And Johan decides to lead really large, almost pot. This is not only a big sizing in general, especially on such a wet turn, but it's also a multi-way spot. If you compare this sizing to a heads-up scenario, you could interpret it as an overbet, a pretty big overbet as well. And that is not only untypical in three-way scenarios to bet this big, but also on these kind of wet turns. Because when ranges bet so big on such wet turns, they isolate continuing ranges of the other players around the wetness of the board. So usually equities of all the players continuing after such a big bet are going to be really high. They will at least have a strong diamond to draw with their hand, already a straight, a lot of two-pair combinations with a diamond, and so on and so forth. So in a lot of rivers, no matter what your value bet was, your equity is going to drop significantly. And for that reason, this sizing is actually extremely really scary to all the players. Now, Maria calls as well. That, on the other hand, is not too scary. She has a lot of one-pair hands that just can't fold. Like one pair with an ace of diamonds. She could have two-pair combinations with a diamond that can draw to flushes, to boats. She could have any pair with a jack for a straight. So if you have a flush here, Maria's call is not yet that concerning. On some rivers, you will have a really tough spot, but you're mostly worried about Johann's range here. And Fedor actually decides to make the fold here in this spot, which might look crazy at first glance, but when you look at the spot, Yo is basically saying, hey, I am trying to extract the maximum value from a check here. I have a check straight beat. That means he could have ace jack as he does, or flush. To have bluffs here, he basically would have needed to lead an ace of diamonds, a naked ace of diamonds on the flop, which I think is pretty far-fetched, or some kind of a hand containing a 10 and a diamond, maybe something like 10-8 offsuit, which should probably fold pre-flop quite a bunch. So Fedor really has a big problem here. He has a very strong hand, but he could be drawing that, and he has no way of improving, and he will probably not get too great information anymore going through the hand. Generally, I agree with Fedor's fold against most players for those reasons. Johann is saying, hey, I want value from a check. That means he often has a 6 high flush beat quite a lot. However, I think he plays a little bit too out of the box for me to make this fold, even though I'm not really sure if a continue is great here. I think there are a bunch of river scenarios where you can get away from your hand or realize your equity quite well. For example, if Johann bets again and Maria calls, I think you have an easy way out. If Johann checks and Maria bets, you probably have a good way out as well. It's a little bit tricky when Johann, as the most unconventional and exploitative player, continues to bet and Maria folds. If it would check to you, you would never value bet a river here. So that already tells you your hand on the turn is already a bluff catcher and doesn't really love life. So I can absolutely get behind Fedor's fold. However, I would have a tough time to do it against a player like Johann. I hope you enjoyed this analysis. If you want more of this content, please join our Discord, Pokercode, for more analysis and free content there.